try to talk a little bit about what's going on here. Before we do, I just want to reinforce something I just said, which is that what Hegel is claiming about individuality or singularity, or the singular, is that it isn't the moment of completion, obviously, of the process, but just because it's that, it's also the moment of its loss, right? And the loss is where it breaks up into these three moments of universality, particularity, and individuality. And Hegel does say, I was looking for it, I didn't see it, so I apologize that I don't have it to hand immediately, but he talks about, where is it? Well, he talks about universality and particularity, and he talks about them in terms of a universal as a this, and a particular as a this, right? So you could talk about individuality as a this, right? That's the thing where you just point at this object. But you could also talk about a particular, this particular, a singular particular, I should say. And you could talk about a singular universal. In the singular universal, this is the abstracted universal, right, is itself a kind of individual at that point. And he calls that a common element. A common element. So it's what things share between them. It's that conception of universality. Now, the reason why I wanted to mention that is because he's about to treat that conception of universality fairly explicitly and work through and beyond it through the judgment forms. He'll do this again in the syllogistic forms as well. The particulars as a this, right, also work this way. They become kind of particularities into themselves. They become a kind of indifferent individuals, indifferent ones into themselves, right? That's the way you can think of that. So the breakup of these three moments renders each one of them individuals, each one of them singular. So you can talk about a singular universal, a singular particular, and a singular singular, right, for this reason. Each one of them would be a this of a different kind in that way. Now, he's going to come back and treat those, as I said, particularly about universality in the judgment forms. So here's the way he defines judgment starting off, right? So he's just introduced it on the previous page by saying, look, it's the loss of the concept, so this is the originative separation, the Teilung, right, the separation or partitioning of these three moments onto their own selves, and this is not an epistemological problematic, so judgment's not, we didn't leave ontology to go off and do judgment as epistemology. No, judgment is another moment in ontology, as will syllogism be. Here's the way he immediately describes or defines judgment. Take a look at this at the top of page 550. This is page 53 in the German. He writes this. Judgment is the determinacy of the concept posited in the concept itself. So I read that to be like always in Hegel, it's a summation of what he's just shown, right? So it's where you've got the determinateness, all three of these moments. They're now posited on their own as three moments on their own. That's the loss of the concept, right? That's what he's defining it. He says the concept's determinations are what we have seen to be the same thing, the determinate concepts, plural, so he's talking about universal concept, particular concept, and then individuality, have already been considered on their own. That's what we were just talking about with the loss of the concept. They can all stand on their own. They can be a this universal, a this particular, or this individual. He then says, they've been considered on their own. But this consideration was more a subjective reflection or subjective abstraction. So we've been talking about it as though it were like this, although it's really ontologically rooted. We've been talking about it like that. But the concept itself is this abstracting. So there's just reinforcing that point, right? This isn't an epistemological problem. Abstraction is an ontological feature of the nature of the concept itself. The opposing, that is the setting over against one another, of its determinations is its own determining. Right? It's what the concept does to itself. It's not what we do to it. It's the Bestimmen, the determining that it does to itself. So he then says, the judgment is this positing, this Setzen, of the determinate concepts by the concept itself. So just in case you were missing the point, this is not an epistemological problem, this is an ontological problem. This is what the concept does itself. So judgment is now the next thing to be considered because it's what the concept has determined itself to be. The concept has determined itself to be lost, to be abstractable into these three moments, and therefore we now got to talk about it in relational terms, note. Right? So when we were dealing with universality, particularity, individuality, and we talked about individuality as the culmination of that, pure processional. Right? No relata. There's not universality over here, particularity over there, and they're related to individuality over here. There's no three things, three moments that get related to one another. But now they've broken apart, not in and of themselves, but because of what individuality is, they've broken apart into these three moments and now can stand on their own. Then we're going to do a relational analysis. That's what judgment is. It's about relationality. So he defines judgment. This is on page now 550 over to 557, this basic structure of judgment, as he calls it, or as he talks about it here. He says there's two things you need to know about judgments. Judgments have two relata, the subject and the predicate. They're distinct from one another. And then, so that's the first thing. And then the relation itself, the copula. So if you want to know anything about a judgment, here's the basics. Subject, predicate, copula. The copula indicates that the predicate belongs to the subject. So think about judgment as predication, right? Predication. You're saying this of this, right? The predicate of the subject. Right? So when you say the subject is the predicate, you're really predicating, you're ascribing the predicate to the subject. It can work the other way, we'll talk about that. But the fundamental form is to say this, is to talk about predication in that way. And that means the copula does this work of combining. So any variations, not just the variations of to be, right, will do this. You could talk about it in terms of if-then, right? If-then is another copula formation in this sense. Either or is a copula formulation here. So it doesn't always have to be is and variations of that. It can be other ways of combining the subject and predicate to one another. It can be if-then, either or. Logical operators is what we would standardly call those. Those are also combinatory as well. So a judgment is a way of relating concepts to one another. A judgment is a way of relating concepts to one another. That relating function is performed by concepts standing in either the subject position or the predicate position, and by virtue of the copula being set in relation to one another. So at its core, a judgment not only relates one concept to another, it ultimately assesses the nature of this relationship. This is where we're headed with judgments, right? Judgments are not just about, oh, look, this x is y, this x is not y, this x is x, right? That's the most basic form of it. That's the judgments of existence. And it's not even, x is y, some x or y, all, it's not the judgments of reflection. We're ultimately going to get to this. X is y, if x is, then y is, x is either. These are combinatory forms. X is y, esoteric, problematic as possibly, as necessarily. Those are making judgments, right? So here's the thing to get, right? Judgments are the relating of concepts to one another through the copula. Absolutely. But fundamentally, they're more than just that. They're rendering a verdict. Right? They're rendering a verdict. These aren't just statements, right? As he's about to say, we can draw a distinction for this reason between Urteil, judgments, and Satz, propositions. Propositions are just any assertion you make. Okay? The King of France is bald. Good for you, right? Great thing to say, right? The United States now has a dictator. Wonderful things to say. Maybe or maybe not true, right? But those are propositions. But what we're looking at is verdicts that are being rendered about concepts. And the verdict that's ultimately going to be rendered is, does this subject necessarily entail that predicate, or does that predicate necessarily entail that subject? What's the nature of that relationship, and what's the verdict being rendered about their relation? So at its core then, a judgment not only relates one concept to another, it ultimately assesses. You could say all judgments are ultimately, not immediately, but ultimately they're evaluative. They're making evaluations, they're making assessments. What are they assessing? Not the nature of reality, right? That's the way we standardly think of it. We think, oh, well, this is saying this is good, this is bad, those are assessments, those are judgments. In that sense, rendering verdicts. No, they're rendering verdicts on the relation itself. It's a verdict as to whether or not the two concepts agree with one another, they fit with one another. So look on 556. 556. He says, this is on 59 in the German. He says, this is the first full paragraph down, to restore again this identity to the concept. Everybody see where I'm at? To restore again, beginning of that concept, beginning of that paragraph. He says, to restore again the identity of the concept, or rather to posit it, this is the goal of the movement of the judgment. So here, these judgment forms are really movement. That's what's being articulated. These rules are rules of movement. What is already present in the judgment is, on the one hand, the self-subsistence, but also reciprocal determinations of the subject and the predicate. So those are what you've already got there, right? The question is, how do they relate to one another, and how do they move in this relation? But also reciprocal determinants of the subject and predicate. And on the other hand, this still abstract connection. The subject is the predicate. This is what the judgment says at first. Subject is the predicate. That's what every judgment says at first, preliminarily. But since the predicate is not supposed to be what the subject is, and that's why they're separate, that's why the subject is distinct from the predicate, a contradiction is at hand that must resolve itself, must pass over into a result. Or rather, since the subject and the predicate are in and for themselves the totality of the concept, and judgment is the reality of the concept, the judgment's forward movement is only development. What comes forth from it is already present in it, and to this extent the demonstration is a display, it's a showing, right? Demonstration, literally we get our word demonstration from this, it's a showing of this, right? A reflection as the positing of that which is already at hand in the extreme terms of the judgment, but even this positing is already present, it is the connection of the extreme. So always what's being evaluated, what's being assessed in judgment forms is, does this subject belong to this predicate and how? Not, is this true of the world? So you can do that kind of analysis, right? You could take judgments and say, well, they've made it, this is a judgment about the nature of reality, and it corresponds or doesn't correspond to the nature of reality. That's not, Hegel's not disallowing that, he's just saying that's not how we're going to approach judgment forms. Our purpose in judgment forms is not the truth logic of correspondence. Our analysis of judgment forms is to see what do they tell us about the subject-predicate relationship and the necessity of the movement from one to the other. Then he says, he lays out all four of the judgment forms. First, as immediate, judgment is the judgment of existence. Its subject is immediately an abstract existent singular. What in the world is an abstract existent singular subject? And the predicate is an immediate determinateness or property of it, an abstract universal. Hold on to that, right? It's an abstract universal. What kind of abstract universal is it in the first form? This is the judgment of existence. Then he says, second, as this qualitative character of the subject and predicate is sublated, the determination of the one begins to shine reflectively in the other. The judgment is now the judgment of reflection. So shine is about reflection, right? It's no longer just about existence, it's about reflection. We're walking back through, right, the logic of being, the logic of essence in the judgment forms. He says, top of page 557, but this external combination passes over into the essential identity of a substantial, necessary combination, and so we have the third, the judgment of necessity. Then fourth, weirdly, right? We don't ever have fourths in Hegel. Here's a fourth. Many papers have been written. Why are there four judgment forms, right? If you want to write that paper again, plenty of literature out there to work on. Well, not plenty, some literature out there. Nobody loves this, right? Fourth, since in the essential identity, the difference of subject and predicate has become a form, the judgment becomes subjective. It entails the opposition of the concept and its reality, and the comparison of the two is the judgment of the concept. Now, when we get to those last two judgment forms, the judgment of necessity, the judgment of the concept, what I'm going to tell you is that they're really just moments of the same thing, right? So there really are three. Right? But the fourth one elaborates a feature that's already at issue with the principle. All right. So back up. So that's the basic layout of what he's going to be doing. Take a look back with me. I alluded to this just a moment ago, but look back on 552. Over to 553. This is 55 to 56 in the German. This is where he draws this distinction between Urteil, judgment, and proposition, Satz. And says, this is about judgment, it's not about Satz. And this is where, to go back to Mohab's question, this is where he introduces his language of subjective meaning and objective meaning. So let's take a look at, for just a moment, at what he means by this. So he says, take a look on 552, page 55 in the German, just after the hyphen. Now any consideration of the judgment can start either from. Everybody see where I'm at? Now any consideration of the judgment, it's about a quarter of the way down the page. Now any consideration of the judgment can start either from the originative unity of the concept or from the self-subsistence of the extremes. Judgment is the self-derision of the concept. This is the originary separation, right? Therefore, it is by starting from the unity of the concept as ground that the judgment is considered in accordance with its true objectivity. In this respect, judgment is the originative division, it goes back, or Teilung in German, of an originative unity. The German word for judgment, Urteil, or primordial division, thus refers to what judgment is in and of for itself. There is, again, referring to this false etymology, but he's using it again to say, look, this is what's at stake here. We've seen why it's at stake. Now we know why we name it that. But the concept is present in the judgment as appearance, since its moments have attained self-subsistence there, and it is to this side of externality that ordinary representation is more likely to fasten. So here's the moment, the epistemological moment, like it says, oh yeah, right. We got abstract universality over here, we got abstract particularity over here, how do we bring the two together? That's the problem, right? And that's an epistemological problem. So then he starts saying, from this subjective standpoint, so if you went down the epistemological rabbit hole, here's what you do. The subject and the predicate are therefore treated as ready-made, each for itself outside the other. Here's the fixity and rigidity that's ontologically rooted. It's there. You can do this. It's just not the ultimate truth. It's not the concept turning back into itself. It's the concept lost into itself. But that's ontologically there. Abstraction is a doing of ontology, right? It's not just what we do in response to it. But it starts there. He says, the subject as a subject matter that would exist even if it did not have that predicate, and this predicate as a universal determination would exist even without accruing to this subject. The act of judgment accordingly brings with it the further reflection whether this or that predicate, which is in someone's head, can and should be attached to the subject matter that exists outside it on its own. So that's the problem, right? How do I get this together with that? The judgment itself is simply the act that combines the predicate with the subject so that if this combination did not occur, the subject and predicate would still each remain what it is, the one concretely existing as the thing in itself, the other is a representation in someone's head. And he says, if that's what you're talking about, then you're just talking about subjective meaning. Right? You're talking about what epistemologically you're saying, oh, here's what I'm trying to say. This thing I'm talking about out here, this particular individual, this tablet, this notebook, it's a notebook, right? Stupid judgment, but there it goes. I've got this thing in my head. Is that in fact matching up? Well, if they do match up, then the subjective sense, the subjective meaning has been demonstrated. It's there. If it fails, then my subjective sense, they're still separate from one another, but they don't match up. So the proposition doesn't bear truth, right? That's what we say. So he says on the top of, take a look now at the last 3 lines on 552, last 3 lines. He says, of course, grammatically speaking, this kind of subjective relation that proceeds from the indifferent externality means a separable different externality, of subject and predicate, is perfectly valid. Right? He's not denying that you can do this. Of course you can do this, right? Of course we can make judgments about things and mean by that, does my knowledge of something, does my concept match up with the world or not? The correspondence problem. He says, for it is words that are here externally combined. All we're talking about is words. He says that it can also be mentioned in this context that a proposition, a Satz, S-A-T-Z, a Satz, can indeed have a subject and predicate in a grammatical sense without ever being an Urteil, a judgment for that. So every Satz is not an Urteil. Because just so you see a Satz, just because someone asserted something doesn't mean that you're talking judgment forms. The latter, the judgment form, requires that the predicate behave with respect to the subject in a relation of conceptual determination, not just I'm asserting this to be the case, subjective determination. Hence, as a universal with respect to a particular or singular. And if what is said of a singular subject is itself only something singular, as for instance, Aristotle died at the age of 73 in the 4th year of the 115th Olympiad, then this is mere proposition, Satz, not a judgment. Right? Interesting fact maybe, but not a judgment. Why? Because it's not about how concepts determine one another. It's about how the singular, Aristotle, was born at a certain time, singular, in a certain year, singular, at a certain event happening, singular. He says, not a judgment. There would be in it an element of judgment only if one of the circumstances, say the date of the death or the age of the philosopher, came into doubt. Because then you'd say, is this singularity really a singularity? Then you're rendering its conceptuality problematic. That's when he says an element of judgment would be involved there. So if it came into doubt, even though the stated figures were asserted on the strength of some ground or other, in that case the figures would be taken as something universal, as a time that, even without the determinate content of Aristotle's death, would still stand on its own filled with some other content or simply empty. Likewise, would the news that my friend N has died be a proposition and a judgment only if there was a question as to whether he is actually dead and not just apparently dead. So these are the questions that raise propositions up to judgments, is the doubt of the singularities, but then that you're raising the singularity up to universals and treating them then as conceptual determinations rather than as factual determinations. Now, having clarified what he's working with, he then launches this discussion of these judgment forms. There's 4 of them, as we've said. And I'm going to walk us through all 4 of them, but let me talk about them in general terms for just a minute. And to do that, I want to look at this chart to try to make some sense. Right? So what I've tried to give you here is all 4 judgment forms, right? They run from existence, reflection, to necessity to concept, right? And he will match them up with quality, quantity, relation, modality, as did Kant, right? So we see that same sort of thing happening here that we saw in Kant. I've tried to give you examples, although they're abstract examples, right, of each one. The forms, basically, this x is y, this x is not y. So you get positive, negative, infinite. You get individual, particular, universal, categorical, hypothetical, disjunctive, and then assertoric, problematic, and apodictic. So what I'd like to say about all of those is this. Ultimately, for Hegel, all judgment forms are about the relating of concepts to one another, in particular, universality, particularity, and singularity to one another. They're all related through the copula, right? So what's at issue in all of them is how is the copula operating? And the way the copula operates is tied up with what kind of universality you've got at issue. Now that doesn't seem intuitively plausible, right? Usually you just want to say, hey, look, you got universality, that's whatever it is over here. And then you got the copula, that is, it's is, or it's the if-then, the either or. It's combinatory, right, to use Kant's language for this. It's combinatory, that's really what it is, synthetic. It joins things together, that's all it is. So it's what it is over here. And really, they don't have much to do with one another. But Hegel's point is that each judgment form is, at its core, about the copula, and it's about the copula because it's about a certain kind of universality. So the copula and universality, in particular, are linked together intimately in all the judgment forms. So when you're talking about, so let me just walk through them for just a moment and talk about how this works. So if you're talking about the judgment form existence, the form of relation is inherent. So when you say this x is y, this x is not y, this x is this x, when you're making those kind of assertions, when you're saying that, what are you doing? Well, you're predicating, right? That's what you do when you relate subject to predicate. You're predicating. That's what the copula is doing. It's predicating. But what kind of predicating is it doing? It's predicating of one thing of another, where it's saying universality inheres in something. One thing inheres in the other one. Ultimately, it's going to be about universality inhering in something else. So the judgments of existence are all about the inherence of one concept in another one. One concept inhering in another. So when you say this x is y, you're saying this y inheres in this x, for example. This x is not this y, you're saying this y does not inhere in this x. When you're saying this x is this x, you're saying this x inheres in itself. When you're saying these things in reflection, x is y, some x are y, all x are y, this isn't about inherence, this is about subsumption. You're saying x is y means that x or y, you can go either way, but let's do it this way. Y is subsumed under x. Y belongs to x. It's one of the features, it's one of the instances of x. It's subsumed under x. Some x are y. Some x's belong, they're subsumed under that y. All x are y. All x's belong under the y. They're subsumed under it. It's a subsumptive way of thinking about the copula relation. So just think through those first two, right? The is functions differently in these two judgment forms. In the first, it's saying, it's predicating inherence relations. One inheres in the other. And inhere, you need to think of as a very surface level way of saying something, right? You're saying this belongs to this other thing because it's a feature of it. In the judgment forms of reflection, you're not saying one thing belongs to another in the sense that it's a feature of it. You're saying that it belongs to it in the sense that it comes under it and is covered over by it and subsumed by it. Now think about this for just a moment. If you're predicating something of another, one thing of another thing, if you're predicating subject of something else, then what are you saying about it? You're saying that it has if you're saying in the judgments of existence, then you're saying it inheres in it in some way. Something inheres in it in some way. What inheres in it? Universality inheres in it. Well, how does universality inhere in something? Well, it's a feature of it. It's a common representation that belongs to all these things. So it's like you said, we're all wearing black shirts. So all these shirts could do what? They inhere in them blackness. It belongs to all of them. Where's the universal blackness? Right here. It inheres in this. It's over there too. It inheres in us, right? It belongs in that sense. It's not something over and above them. It's a common feature that belongs to all these things. Hegel will call that a qualitative conception of universality. It's where universality is not anything over and above a feature that's shared by a lot of particulars. but it is just the feature they all have in common. Right? This is a kind of nominalistic conception of universality. Right? Universality is nothing over and above the particulars, it's just the shared common feature they all have sharing and in common with one another. But it's nothing over and above them. So that form of universality is an abstract universality because it's a shared universality that belongs to a bunch of particulars. It's nothing over and above them. And Hegel thinks that's the most abstract conception of universality. We'll say, that's not our standard conception of abstract universality. We normally think of class concept of universality as being the most abstract, but Hegel will say, no, the most abstract concept of universality is where there really is nothing to universality at all, other than it's being borne by a bunch of things that happen to have it. There is no concept black. There's just a bunch of black things. So when Hegel's talking now about the judgment form of reflection, is still the main operator here, right? It's still copula, still predication, still going on. But notice, it's not about inherence now. Judgments of existence are about inherence. The judgments of reflection are about subsumption. The predication is predicating one thing is subsumed in another. Now we're saying all of our black clothes are subsumed under the concept black. Black is now a class concept, right? It's the universal that's a class of which all these particulars are subsumed under or subsumed in, whatever your favorite way of putting that might be. But notice, it stands on its own. It's a universal that now stands on its own. Abstract, yes, still abstract, but now standing on its own, separate from all the various instances of it. Now we're talking about something that's closer to, I'll use these terms very loosely, so please don't, show me the 15 different dialogues where this is not true. But this is more like a Platonic conception of universality, where we can talk about particularization, participation, as being the way in which something is what it is. It's subsumed under this concept. My favorite example, this is from the Euthyphro. Socrates sitting around like he always is. A person walks by, where are you going? My good friend, I'm on my way to go prosecute my father. Oh, why would you do such a thing? We all know that's horrible and wrong. Why are you doing that? How could it possibly be the just thing to do? You must know what justice is. That's the trick, right? You must know what justice is. And the guy goes, well, yeah, justice is obviously, all right, there's the whole dialogue in a nutshell, starts going off from there. But what's Socrates getting him to do? To admit that there's this thing called justice, class concept, that this particular instance, walking in and prosecuting your father, falls under, subsumed under that. It doesn't just bear it, right? Like the color feature that we talked about. Now it's something that is subsumed under the class concept itself. That's a judgment of reflection, class concept. Now, Hegel's going to make the case that one entails the other, right? That inherence entails the class. So you can't really do inherence without talking about it in terms of subsumption. So this is the argument he's going to make. We'll watch him, we'll see the argument unpack, but we'll unpack the argument as he makes it. But let's just follow the overall train of the argument through and see what he does in the last two judgment forms. Then we'll go through and unpack each one on their own terms. What he says about the judgment of necessity, and as I said, the judgment of necessity and judgment of concept are really two sides of one coin, but let's keep them separate for the moment, is that if you want to think about judgments of necessity, then you're talking about categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive judgments, right? Here you now move beyond just the is of predication. You're starting to use the if, then, the either, or, right? Logical operators. And in that sense, what are you saying? Well, you're saying these concepts are related to one another. That's always what every judgment form is saying. The concepts are combined in some way. But now the combination is not one of just they're subsumed or one inheres in the other. You're saying they're necessarily related. Notice it's in this sense, a claim about their relationality. Categorical means it's absolutely the case. Hypothetical, well, if this is, then this is. Disjunctive, well, it's either this or this or this. So it's relational. Now you're talking about relations of specification. You're specifying out the various moments of the concept in relationship to one another. Well, that means you're thinking about universality not as a shared feature, not as abstract universality in that sense, not as inherent universality, but you're also not thinking about it as subsumptive. And this, as I've already hinted, is the key thing. It's what's key here, it's what will be key in the syllogisms. Universality, according to Hegel, ultimately and fundamentally, is not ultimately and fundamentally an abstract feature of things that are shared and inhering in a bunch of things. It's not qualitative. It's also not quantitative, it's not subsumptive, it's not a class. That fundamentally, to think about universality is to think about it as a genus, where the genus is not subsumptive. He knows well the history of genus is to think of it in subsumptive terms. It's a covering term for a bunch of species, as we've talked about before. But he's going to say the way to think about genus is always as a genus specifies itself. There is no genus if it doesn't have species. The species are what the genus is. The genus is nothing over and above the species. So when we say this is a categorical, hypothetical, disjunctive relation, what that categorical relation or the hypothetical disjunctive is saying is there's a relationship here between the various species of this universality. So they're thinking of the relationship between universality, particularity, and individuality as specification, not as subsumption, not as inherence. It's thinking about it as specification. Well, now we know, because that already sounds close to what we've been talking about, with universality particularizing itself. That's exactly what we're now getting back to. We're seeing that the inherence and subsumptive relations ultimately entail specification relations. And those specification relations are ultimately a matter of the concept, the modality. Here we're saying esoteric, problematic, or apodictic. That's a determination. It's not just, here's a bunch of species that fulfill or express or define universality. This is actually what universality is. It's its own determinations of itself. Its own determinations of itself. That's what's being asserted in an esoteric or problematic or an apodictic judgment form. So notice, Hegel's going to give us examples. One of the few places in the logic where Hegel gives you examples. They're not great, right? The rose is red, the rose is flowering, all that kind of wonderful stuff. So it's not great and wonderful. Why? Because the point isn't about the object. It's not about the aboutness, right, of any judgment. That's not what these judgment forms are trying to tell you about. They're not trying to tell you about, oh, here's how this works in terms of these practical examples. What he's trying to get out of the judgment forms is what do they tell us about the relation of concepts to one another, in particular the concepts of universality, particularity, and individuality. How do they relate to one another? That's what these judgment forms tell us. That's the leading clue that we need to follow. So let's walk our way. Does that make a little bit of sense? Right? So the ultimate, here's the basic message here. The ultimate point of the judgment forms is about the copula, how it operates. Here's the way the copula is being thought in each one, the form of relation. It's how they're being combined. What's being combined here is universality, particularity, and individuality, or singularity. That's what the combinatory logic is really about. How are those three to be combined? Is it to be combined in terms of inherence, one inheres in the other, or is it to be combined in terms of subsumption, or in terms of specification or determination? That's really what's being combined. That's what the combinatory logic here. And that's all predicated, sorry to use the term here, that's all predicated on how you understand or how each one of these judgment forms operates with universality. Is universality abstract in the sense that it's a quality that's shared? Or is it a class that subsumes? Or is universality the genus that specifies and the genus that determines? Right. Let's walk back through each one of these and try to rehearse some bit of these ideas and look at a few of the examples that Hegel gives us. So the basic form of the judgment of existence, let's start with the judgments of existence. Here he calls this, the judgment forms of the judgment of existence is really about what he calls qualitative universality, qualitative or abstract universality, qualitative universality. So the basic form is the subject is posited in a universality as its predicate, which is an immediate and hence sensible quality. So the universal is thought as a sensible quality. The universal, which is the predicate in these judgment forms, the universal is the predicate here, it's the Y. Inheres in the individual, in the subject. So the transformation, the development takes place mainly in the predicate. Right? So it's the predicate really being thought. So you can say the rose is fragrant, the rose, the singular, is fragrant, universal, but notice fragrant is not something unto itself. Fragrant is something that that rose and that rose and that rose has, and maybe this particular perfume has, and this particular bar soap has, and things that smell well, smell pleasantly. They're fragrant in this sense. Well, that's something that doesn't exist over and above. Fragrant is not something over and above. It's something that's possessed by it. It's a qualitative universal in that sense, right? It's shareable. It's inherent in those things. So the rose is fragrant. The singular is universal, or the universal is singular in that sense, right? You can say the universal is singular. But that means it's possessed by, or it inheres in the singular. The rose is not fragrant, right? That's just saying, well, fragrance doesn't inhere in this particular singular. And then you can say, like the infinite thing, the rose is not a table. Well, that's nonsense. It doesn't tell you anything. Right? It doesn't have any significance at all because it's a singular and a singular being related to one another. So in judgments of existence, the subject is essential, has a priority over against the predicate. So that's really where the locus of everything. And the subject in all of these are singulars. So that's judgments of existence are about singulars, and they're predicating things of them. Those predicates inhere in them. Those predicates are universality. So the copula in here, in these forms, in this form of judgment, is a sheer or immediate identity. It's a sheer is the way Hegel puts it, that immediately identifies a universal quality in the predicate, a sheer abstraction as inhering in a equally immediate individual singular subject. Positive. The singular is the universal. The copula's immediacy results in the collapse of the judgment form into the infinite judgment, right? That's what the purpose of that nonsense at the end is about, right? Saying, but look, that means that the is just will allow anything to be identified with the other thing, right? Anything related to anything else. In which the domain of universality is wholly separated from the domain of singularity. The result is either nonsense, any property that does not belong to the subject becomes attached to it. This singular is not a universal property. It's not an elephant, right? You can say. And ultimately, it's an empty tautology. The only property that is ascribed to the subject is its own undifferentiated, indeterminate self. The singular is the singular. The universal is the universal, which is just as nonsensical as well. It's empty tautology. This necessitates, he says, a transition. So because of this falling apart of the judgment form, right, through the tautology, through the empty tautology and the nonsense of the infinite judgment form and judgments of existence, that necessitates the move to judgments of reflection. Right? So now the is has got to do some work, not just be an immediate identification of the two with something else. And what is that work that it does? It subsumes. So inherence logic, the broad claim is that inherence logic ultimately fails because it ultimately just ascribes relations between everything, which means nothing. Right? It's really not a judgment at all. It's not ascribing anything of anything at the end of the day. It doesn't really do any work. So it's got to be something other than that. Well, what is that? Well, that means that it does something like subsumption. So here's the judgments of reflection. And here we can talk about a quantitative universality, what Hegel will sometimes call allness or communality. These are all terms he uses for this. He will also call this external universality. Those are all equivalent terms for Hegel. It's quantitative ways of thinking about universality. And at the core of them, the model that's at work here, as we've already said, is that of a class. It's a class concept. Rather than a qualitative feature born or inhering in a lot of different particulars, singulars, it is actually now a class unto itself. So the predicate here is no longer an immediate abstract quality, but something through which the subject proves itself to be related to something else, so to another. So it's a concept into itself. It really is a class into itself. The predicate is. The universal, the predicate, subsumes then the individual. So notice this is the exact reverse of what we saw in the judgments of existence. Judgments of existence were all about the subject having something predicated of it. So something belongs to or inheres in the subject. That's always what a judgment of existence ultimately does. It's ultimately its downfall, but that's what it ultimately does. But the judgments of reflection are all about, the predicate is the real fundamental moment, and the subjects are all being subsumed under the predicate. That's what the predication is doing here, different than the is a predication in the judgments of existence. So you can say things like, let's go back to the rose, to stay with Hegel's examples here. This rose is medicinal. This rose, so there's the singular, is now medicinal. You're saying, it's one of the things that's medicinal. It's not the only thing that's medicinal, and it doesn't possess medicinality, right, as one of its features, that it's inherent in it, like fragrance would be. Here you're saying, no, it's a member of the class. Medicinal. You can also make particular judgments. Some roses are medicinal. Right? This particular is something universal. It belongs in there, but other ones don't. And you can do the universal. All roses are medicinal. What each one of those judgment forms ultimately does is it subsumes the subject under the predicate, because the predicate is now universal that stands on its own, whereas in the judgments of existence, the predicate were universals, yes, but they couldn't stand on their own. They always were buried in or belonged to or inhered in the singular. So here we move from, as I said earlier, a nominalist form of judgment. I'm saying that things are black, but I'm not saying there's such a thing as black itself. Right? So there's no concept. Right? They're all just names. We're nominalists, so they're just names. So here we're just going to say this is what belongs to this. Right? Black belongs to these things, or fragrance belongs to these flowers, this rose. We're not saying there's fragrance in and of itself, but here, no, now we're saying medicinal is something that stands over and above, abstract from, on its own. Roses. Roses belong to it. They're subsumed under it. They don't inhere in it. They are subsumed under it. Right? And that means they are instantiations of it. If you want to do the reverse way of thinking about this, they're instantiations of it. So here, the copula is not immediate. Here's the real difference between the judgments of existence and judgments of reflection. The copula is not immediate, but equal. It unites the singular with the universal through particularity. We're saying the roses have a feature, a particularity, a feature about them, and that particularity subsumes them under universality. If you look at the judgments of existence, the singular and particular are collapsed. They're both in the subject. And then the predicate, right, fragrance, its particularity too, but its particular universality. And you're just saying, oh, it belongs in, it's a feature of these particular objects. That's that judgment form, that's how it operates. So it really is, there's a distinction between universality, particularity, and singularity there, but they really are all collapsed into one another. So they're there, but the is of inherence, so it collapses them immediately. What the judgments of reflection does is it separates them back out. It says the singular has some features about it, particulars. Those features make it possible that that thing, the singular, the rose, can be subsumed under a universal that stands on its own. So now rather than collapsing all three, you've got them distinguished from one another and related to one another. And the relation passes through, made possible by, the particularity. This will become immensely important as we move along. So in the judgments of reflection, what allows the three moments to stand apart, this is abstraction, right? This is still a problem, right, for Hegel ultimately, but it's better than the judgments of existence because it at least has the articulation of all three moments, is you have singularity on its own, the rose. The singularity of that rose also has a particular feature about it, it's medicinal. And because it has that particular feature about it, it can be subsumed under the general concept, medicinality, I made up the term. Medicinality, right? It can be subsumed under that concept. There's the universal. And you can talk about this rose, you can talk about some roses, right? So that's how you can do the individual or singular, the particular, and the universal. You can say all roses belong under this. That's where you get the allness coming out. Now, here's the key thing in that last bit, right? So far so good. It sounds like, oh, the judgments of existence are kind of, not very interesting judgments ultimately, because what they're really saying is the singular is singular, right? The singular is a particular that's got particulars about it that are also singular. That's ultimately what all the judgments of existence are really saying. They're predicating of the singular that it also has features that also are singular. And that's important, right? But that's just an is of immediate inherence. What the judgments of reflection, and that leads you to ultimately to nonsense or tautology, right? So there's where it falls apart, there's its breakdown. And Hegel says that shows us that the is has to be doing something more than just inherence. It's got to be combining, but it can't be just combining as inherence. It's got to be combining as something more. What's the more? Subsumption is the more. Well, here in the judgments of reflection, we're now doing something like what we think of as standard predication. Right? So if you ask somebody what's predication, essential predication in particular, but just predication in general, this is what they'd be talking about. It's what Hegel calls a judgment of reflection. It's where you take an individual, singular, and you say, because it has this particular feature about it, it's subsumable under this universal. because this particular object has the function of being able to be sat upon, that's this particular feature, it can be subsumed under the concept chair. So far, so good, right? But that's, I mean, if you just step back and said, well, what is that about? You would say, well, that's the logic of subsumption is the logic of abstraction. When I'm abstracting out a concept, ultimately what I'm trying to do is not say, well, it inheres in all these various things. That's not what abstraction does. Abstraction says, no, I've got a concept, right? It's Platonic. I've got a concept, and now I want to see what falls under that concept. What can be subsumed under that concept? What are, put it in the other way, instantiations of this concept? That's a judgment of reflection. So that sounds like essential predication, right, the way you would do it. But once all the singulars, so look at that last category where you say all X's are Y's, all roses are medicinal. The universal is something universal, right? The universal collection of all these objects are in fact universal. Once all singulars are subsumed under the universal, once they've all been put under the class of all, then the singular as such just is the universal. You've collapsed the two. The singular just is the universal. What makes a singular belong to that class is that singular is grouped together with all other singulars to whom it is now no other determinate relation other than their shared inclusion. They've all been subsumed. They all have the same particularity, so they all belong. You know, all the flowers, all the roses are medicinal, so they all belong because they're all medicinal. Hence, through the universal judgment of reflection, the singular is immediately determined as universal, and it is this precisely as singular. Thus, the universal doesn't inhere in the singular, as it did in the judgments of existence, nor does the singular stand only as a particular instance of the universal, as we started with the universal in the judgments of reflection. Rather, the singular now, in this final moment, right, in the singular, all in the universal judgment of reflection, all singulars, all roses are medicinal, all X's are Y. The singular now has its own encompassing nature in the universal with nothing left over, nothing remaining. It's fully and completely subsumed. The universal is thus now not a property or quality, nor a class. It had been a class in the first two determinations, the first two judgment types under logical reflection. It's now not a class concept anymore. It's something that specifies what the singularity is. In other words, it particularizes itself. Now think about that for a moment. See, Hegel's claiming that the ultimate logic of subsumption drives you to a conception of universality as class that ultimately undoes itself. That it can't remain a class concept. Because if you're saying all things belong under it, or subsumed in it, then all those things just are it. The concept just is, right, the universal just is those specifications of itself. So now, universality is just those specifications of itself. That sounds familiar. That's totality and principle. It's exactly right. That's what he's arguing. He's saying that in the judgment of reflection, in the universal form of that, we've reached the moment where universality can no longer be a class concept. It has to be a genus. It has to be productive of its own determinations. It's a genus that he originally says pervades its species, the singulars, by dictating the particularities that define the species itself. Dictates the particularities that define the species itself. Well, that is the moment of necessity. That's the moment of necessity. Because now you've got a relation that says universality is not just subsumptive, it's not subsuming of these singulars, it's productive of them. So far, so good? Make a little bit of sense? All right, we've got two more judgment forms to go. We've got a little bit of time. Let me work my way through both of those. Then we'll come back and take questions about them at the end, and then we'll set ourselves up to go look at syllogisms from that. So judgments of necessity now. Right? Judgments of necessity have this fundamental form. The predicate expresses the inner substance or nature of the subject. The predicate expresses the inner nature or substance, of the subject. So now it's not about inherence, it's not about subsumption. It's about expression and determination. The predicate is not subsuming of the subject. The subject doesn't, the predicate doesn't inhere in the subject. Rather, the predicate expresses itself in the subject. The nature of the copula, then, is not inherence, and it's not subsumption. Well, what is it? It's specification. Take a look at the examples, the categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive. The rose is a plant. The rose is a plant. It's a genus-species relation. The rose is a plant, right? The rose is one form of plant. It's one species of plant. Then you can say things like the causal relationship. If it is a rose, then it is medicinal. You can make those kind of causal relations. That's the hypothetical relation. You can do the disjunctive. The rose is either dog or Gaelic or red leaf or Cherokee or chestnut. In other words, it's one of these species. But notice, all of that is about its specifications now. So the categorical judgment, the first judgment, the rose is a plant, simply posits the conclusion at which the universal judgment or reflection arrived. The singular is the universal. The singular is the rose is the plant. It just posits that, it just says that, which we'd already reached with the universal in the judgment of reflection. What is intended by this judgment, the judgment form, not the speaker, not the judger, but the judgment form itself, is that the singular is in itself the genus or the objective universal. It just is that. It doesn't subsume under that. It doesn't, and the universal doesn't inhere in it. It just is an expression of that universal. So in this case, rose is an expression, one, many expressions of plant. In this sense, then, in the categorical judgment, the copula is supposed to disappear as a combination of the subject and the predicate. Rather, the copula simply asserts the transforming of the singular into the universal, or even better, not into, but as the universal. So you could read that as the rose is a plant. You could just say the rose plants, right? That's what it is, just that thing. Or better said, the plant just is expressed in rose as one of its many species. And yet the form of the categorical judgment remains immediate. It's still an is. It's still predication through the is structure. And it is that immediacy that ultimately destroys that intention. It doesn't ultimately accomplish that because it establishes a relation, but it doesn't tell us the nature of that relation. Well, that's what the logical operators then come in to do in the second and third forms. That the if-then, the hypothetical, and the disjunctive, the either-or, are all ways of showing what specification looks like. Specification can be thought of as if this, then this, so it's causal in the broad sense. Right? If you have this, then this will happen. If it is a rose, then it is medicinal, it has this feature about it. Or it's disjunctive. The rose is either, and here's, you can give it specifications. You can say the plant is either, and give it many different specifications. That's the genus species. The genus is the species, and it's being specified. That's literally what disjunction is the specification of the genus through the logical operator of either or. So what's going on then in the judgment of reflection is precisely the objective universal is determining itself. The objective universal, right? Not the abstract universal, the qualitative universal, or the mathematical or external or quantitative universal. Those universals can't determine themselves. They can inhere in something else, and then universality and singularity and particularity all collapse. Or they can be subsumed, but when you subsume them, you're just taking you're taking singularity and subsuming it under universality through particularity, but that all ultimately collapses them back into universality. But if they're really all universality, then universality's got to generate all of them. That's what the judgments of necessity are trying to lay out. What the first categorical form of that does, what the first categorical form of judgments of necessity does, is simply assert what was already there in the universal form, right? The universal form of judgment of reflection. But then what the hypothetical and disjunctive does is say, okay, what does specification actually look like? What's the logical operations for doing that? That's what that is. And then he says, just one point about the either or that's in the operative and the disjunctive judgment. This will come back in the disjunctive syllogism, so it's worth noting here. Hegel always reads disjunction as at once exclusive and inclusive. No surprise, right, in this, right? Disjunction is differentiation. And differentiation is never radical separation. It's always setting them in relationship to one another, and in that sense, it's saying the genus is all of these things. It's either this, or this, or this, or that. So it's not saying they're all separable from one another. It's saying all these are exclusionary in the sense that it could be this, or this, or this, or this. So it's genuine differentiation. But that genuine differentiation is also inclusive because they're all moments of the genus and its specification. There's that totality and principle thing we saw with particularity playing out again here. So the either or of the disjunctive is fundamentally then inclusive. A is not only B, but also C. B and C both belong to and comprise the identity of A. He calls this the objective universal, exhibits itself fully in its particularity. But it's also, the either or is also exclusive. It particularizes species, excludes one from another, and does so oppositionally or contradictorily. So is this ultimately what it is for the genus to specify itself? Hegel claims it doesn't. That's why you have to have a fourth category. So look at where he says this. Take a look on, this is 581. So this is the passage that we all go to and we're trying to figure out why is there a fourth category here? Why do we have not just three? Why is there a judgment of not just necessity, but why is there a judgment of the concept? Why do we have the final modal category? Here's what Hegel says about this. This is on 581. This is 83 in the German. Last two paragraphs of the section. In the first instance, everybody see where I'm at? In the first instance, right in the middle of the page. He writes this. In the first instance, the disjunctive judgment has the members of the disjunction in the predicate. So either this, the rose is either this, or this. So the rose is the singular, it's the subject, is either this or this, that's the predicate. So notice now the is has been broken up into this logical operator, either or. But the judgment is itself equally disjoined. What's that mean? There's disjunction clearly in the predicate, right? That's the enumeration of all the various species that whatever the singular is. He says, its subject and predicate are the members of the disjunction. They are the moments of the concept posited in their determinants, but at the same time as identical. Identical, he says, alpha, in the objective universality which is in the subject as the simple genus, and in the predicate as the universal sphere and the totality of the moments of the concept. So they're identical. This is the moment of totality, right? We've already seen this in particularity. Universality is particularizing itself, the genus is particularizing itself in all these species. Right? So this genus is the species. So this rose is now a genus. It has all these various different kinds of roses. They're all the species of that rose. It's exhaustive. That just is what the genus species, the genus rose is. So that's identical. But he then says, in beta, in the negative unity, the developed connectedness of necessity, in accordance with which the simple determinants in the subject has fallen apart into the difference of the species. Fallen apart. Right? So here's this moment again where we talk about, well, I thought we were, finally there, like with individuality, like with singularity. Oh, it's the return of the concept into itself. Absolutely, says Hegel. And it's also the loss of it at the same time. It's both simultaneously. Well, here, the same thing's true here. When you've reached this moment, the disjunctive judgment in the judgments of necessity, what you've got is an articulation of the genus-species relationship, which is concrete universality. It's what universality is. It's universality particularizing itself, and thereby reaching individuality, right? So that's what a rose is, to use this example. It is all these species of roses, and when you go pick up the rose at the garden center, right, that's an individual rose that is the expression of that process. So it's got all that right there. And of course, it's all right there, but it's also separable. It's all the culmination of it, right? The concept returns into itself. When you buy the rose, right? You buy the Cherokee rose, there it is. Beautiful, wonderful, I love it. But it's also an it. It can be a this now. It's separable, ontologically, it's separable from all the other moments. So he's saying, it's fallen apart into the difference of the species. It's just one thing. It's just the Cherokee variety of the rose. And he says, and these, in this very difference, have their essential connection in self-identity. In other words, they're just what they are unto themselves. They can break apart. Here's that problem again that we saw. Here's the loss of the concept in the judgment form. the loss of the concept in the judgment form. So what the last judgment form addresses is not the genus-species relationship. That's the relationship. That's what the judgment forms are ultimately telling us about, is genus-species relationship. But what they haven't given us is the modality of that relationship. They haven't given us the modal nature of that relationship. What they've said is, just to stay with our example, a rose can have a plethora of different varieties. Right? And because rose can be either or, disjuncted, differentiated into all those various varieties, then the danger inherent in that, well, let's do both sides. The culminating moment in that is, that's what rose is. Rose is nothing other than, there's no rose class concept, and there's not rose as an inherent feature. Rose is just those specifications. It's all those species. That's all it is. It's nothing over and above them. It just is all of them. That's its totality. That's its principle. But they can all stand on their own. We don't mistake them in doing that. That's just true of them. When it culminates like that, it also can stand on its own. Why does it stand on its own? This is what Hegel's struggling with here at the end. Why do they stand on their own? Because they stand on their own right now, at this moment, the judgment of necessity. They stand on their own because they're just moments of differentiation, specification. That's all they are. What we don't have here is any kind of necessity modal. We don't have any necessity to that differentiation. It's just a bunch of damn species. That's what they are. Here's the plethora of them. Right? And here's a nuts question, right? It's a crazy question, right? Just stay with Hegel's example. You would never ask, and could never ask, someone in the gardening business this question. Why are there just these species? Well, they're not. They're coming up with new ones all the time. Well, is there a principle by which they're doing that? Yeah, what the customer wants. Arbitrary preferences. And you could say, well, I don't know if you know this, but there is no such thing as rose. They'll go, I sell flowers. What do I care about this? You should care about this, because there is no rose that you're selling. Well, right, I just sell varieties of roses. Right, and rose is just all those varieties of roses. Yes, that's right. I'll get you that. Where's this going? Well, rose is just that variety, right. But there's no principle of differentiation to that variety. There's no necessity of why it has to differentiate itself like that. And they'll go, what the hell are you talking about? The reason why we have the different varieties of roses is, I told you, because we do hybrid stuff all the time and grow the ones that, survive in the freaking 1 degree winter inside. Because that's what the customers want. So that's how variation works. That's what hybridization does. That's empirical specification. And Hegel says, right, that's exactly what you've got here in the genus-species relationship. You've got specification, but you haven't got necessitation. Disjunctive judgments give us the genus-species relation. They absolutely do. But they give it to us without necessity. They give it to us with happenstance, arbitrariness. I just gave examples of preference, satisfaction, right? That's what they're responding to. So why does the rose get proliferated out into these various differentiated out, these various species? Because that's what the people want. Not because there's anything about the rose concept that necessarily does that. So what's doing the specifying here? Wants and demands, not the concept itself. So that's why you need a fourth judgment form. The fourth judgment form addresses not the genus-species relation in creating that. The genus-species relation is already on the table. The question here is, what's the predication now, not about genus-species, but what's the modality of that relation itself? What's the modality of that relation itself? It's about the mode of agreement, as he says, between the singular and the universal, the mode of agreement. And I'd put a lot of weight on mode there, modality, right? What's the modality of that relationship? Is it one of contingency, or is it one of necessity? Fundamentally, that's it. Now look at what the three forms are, right? Under the judgments of the concept. Assatoric just says X is Y, right? It just gives you this X is Y claim. Well, that looks like this X is Y. It's not the same, but it's X is Y. It's the universal is differentiation. That's what it says. And now you've got the problematic. It's possibly someone. Now you've got the introduction of possibility in here. You've got the introduction of modality in here. The final one is it necessarily? That's what we're getting. So notice what he does here. He says, fill in the examples here again. You can do the esoteric is the rose is beautiful, the rose is good. You can say the rose is possibly beautiful or good. You can say it's necessarily beautiful or good. So those examples of the esoteric, the problematic, and the apodictic nature of this. The first is just simply saying, here's a feature of it. Here's a specification of it. Here's something that is true of it. The second one says it's possibly true of it. Again, it's open. And the third one says, no, this is what it is to be that thing. Well, what it is to be that thing is essential predication, right? So now we're finding out that to be a concept, it can't just be a matter of, well, here's what it is. Here's what it possibly is. It's got to be here's what it necessarily is. In order to be this concept, it has to proliferate itself in this way. So now if we go back to that example, right, we go back to the example of the rose is all these variety of roses, we can say, actually, no. It's not just a matter of responding to customer preference. It actually is the rose to be what it is, has to differentiate itself into these forms. Now, do we know what all the forms would be from that? No. But does it have to differentiate itself? Absolutely. Notice that's an important difference, right? Because one says, we know where it ends. We know there's a finite number of species that the rose, or whatever the concept universal, particularizes itself into. We know what exhaustion would be. We know when the totality has been reached. We know what the principle demands, and now we know what the totality, the completion, the exhaustion point is. We know what it's reached. We know when we're done. And Hegel wants to say, no, we don't know that. This is the way I understand what he's claiming, right? We don't know where specification ends, but we do know that specification is necessary, particularization is necessary, in order for universality to be what it is. And only the judgment form of concept, the judgment of concept form, and only the one of apodicticity gives you that relationship in that modal form. So there and there only do you have the judgment of genus is the species, because specification is necessarily what the genus is, and nothing else and nothing more. And again, that doesn't tell you what species and how many species you have to have. So one of the interesting things, you now can run this back to what he says about particularity as being totality. He says, remember he said there, particularity as totality means what? That there are no more species. The species just is these various, the genus just is these various species, and that's all. There's nothing more to it. And you immediately want to say, well, what's the mark? How do we know when we're done? Whenever the concept finishes, it exhausts itself. How do you know when the concept exhausts itself? As far as I can tell in Hegel, you don't know that. There's nothing intrinsic to the nature of absolute negativity that says, oh, once you've done 14, once you've done 12, once you've done 57, then you're done. In each one of them, Hegel says, right, in each individual, it comes back to itself. So that can't be it. It can't be where it culminates, because it culminates in everything. This is as much a culmination of the concept as this is a culmination, as I'm a culmination, as you. All that's a culmination of the concept. So that's not going to help. Right? It's all proliferation of the concept. It's all differentiation of the concept. It's all genus specifying itself. So we can't know when it's exhausted itself, but we can know not just that it does exhaust, not that it does specify itself, which is what judgments of judgments of necessity give us. The judgment of the concept really gives you that that's a necessary relation, that specification is necessary itself. All right. Let's see where we're at there. Yeah. So does that make roughly some sense about working through all the judgment forms? Now, I don't think I did a terribly good job of why one leads into the next, right? I've tried to link them up to one another. I've tried to talk about, in the first one, the problem of the judgment of existence is the copula itself. That leads to the reflection where the copula becomes thought not as inherence but as subsumption. The problem here is about the universal. This is literally saying that universality is singularity. Universality is singularity. But that means that you've got to rethink the nature of those two moments. they can't be a relation of subsumption anymore. So the subsumption has to be rethought as a relationship of the hypothetical and disjunctive. Those are the logical operators that really pull out and specify what that relationship is. And then what the final moment does is it really gives you the modality of it. I know this isn't judgment of necessity, so this always bothers everybody. Why is the judgment of necessity ultimately about not necessity, right? It's not really about necessity. The judgment of the concept is really about necessity, because that's what apodicticity really gives you. So that's roughly how he's working through the judgment forms, trying to make some sense of them. Does that make some general sense to people? All right. And let me just add one thing to that, and then I'll finish for tonight, and we'll come back and talk about this, obviously, a ton next week. Hegel's claim. Hegel's claim is that the apodictic judgment form entails syllogisms. Entails syllogisms. And we'll look at this closely next week. We'll look at the transition. So the transition you want to look at, obviously, is the disjunctive judgment form is on, this is on page 585 to 587. So we'll start class next week by talking about that transition, because this is the transition from judgment to syllogism. But at its core, here's really what he's claiming. He's claiming that in the judgment of the concept, in the apodictic form, that's really, in the apodictic form, it looks like one judgment. It looks like X is necessarily Y. It looks like just one singular judgment. It's actually a buried syllogism. Right? What's buried in there is actually syllogistic. That it's a relation between judgments that establishes that as its conclusion. So it looks like a bare judgment. It's not. Implicitly already, what's operative there is a syllogistic inferring work going on there. So he unpacks it, right? He stops at that moment. He says, look, here's what the X is necessarily Y is. It's really a set of judgments that really entail, that infer that as its conclusion. You've got to establish relationships that actually lead to that as its conclusion. So judgments aren't able, the fundamental, most highest form of judgment actually can't be a judgment alone. It's got to already be syllogistic. It's got to be a relation between judgments, not a relation between concepts. We'll get to that in syllogism, but it's a relation between judgments. So there's his argument for why you have to move from, not only are we talking about concepts, and concepts have to be related through judgments, we're talking about judgments that necessarily have to be related through syllogisms. And that's the move he's going to make on that paragraph, on those pages. We'll come back and take a look at that next time, because that's absolutely crucial for what he thinks about a syllogism as being, right? Because he's going to make these crazy claims. There's a lot of crazy claims in the science of logic. Here's one that everybody loves. See if I can find it in English. Yeah. So take a look on page 588. 588 is the first paragraph of the syllogism chapter. Page 90 in the German. He says this: the syllogism is the result of the restoration of the concept in the judgment, and consequently the unity and the truth of the two. We'll come back and talk about how that works always. These are summary passages, right, where he's summarizing what he's already shown. The concept as such holds its moment sublated in this unity in judgment. The unity is an internal, or what amounts to the same, an external one. There's that flapping back and forth, right? We move from internal to external. How's that work? We'll talk about it. And although the moments are connected, they are posited as self-subsisting extremes. In the syllogism, the determinations of the concept are like the extremes of the judgment, and at the same time, their determinate unity is posited. So that's what you accomplish. You see that the judgment form, the highest judgment form, the apodictic judgment form, is ultimately entails syllogisms. Wonderful. Then he says, thus, the syllogism is the completely positive concept. Now that's no small achievement, right? Let's be clear. Right? This is what, we started trying to figure out, what is the concept? And we start off by saying, well, the concept is universality, that necessitates particularity, that becomes individuality. And you saw, well, that has to be related, and that's the judgment forms. He's saying the syllogism's it, baby. This is it. This is the formal structure of the concept as such. Thus, the syllogism is the completely positive concept. Then if you don't think that's enough, he says, it is therefore the rational. Now, he does not mean by that, this is the way we reason. Secondarily, that's true. But he's literally saying, this is the rationality of actuality, that famous line out of the preface to the philosophy of right. Here's the rationality of all things. Everything is fundamentally syllogistic in its structure. Well, wait a minute. That's bonkers. Because we all know that syllogism is how we think about the world. It's how we reason about the world. It's how we argue with one another. It's how we form arguments, relating of judgments to one another and reach conclusions that are bad forms or good forms. All that kind of, we know that, but that's us. Right? It's not the world. It's us. But what he means by what that statement he just made is that it is the rational. It's not our reasoning capacity. It's the nature of reason in the world itself. If you don't believe that, he says, 589, next page over, just to make this point again, he says, second line down, if, this is 91 in the German, if reason is supposed to be a cognition that would know about God, freedom, right and duty, the infinite, the unconditional, the supersensible, or even gives only representations and feelings of such objects, okay, Kant, that's what reason is, then for one thing these objects are only negative, and for another the original question still stands, what is there in all these objects that makes them rational? So not just what's our reasoning capacity, right? This is the highest aspiration of the first critique, right? To discipline reason, right? To critique reason is to discipline, set its boundaries. What can you know? What can't you know? What can you reason about? What can't you really reason about? You can't reason about God, freedom, or immortality, for example. Doesn't mean you can't think them, but it means you can't reason about it. You can't apply syllogisms to them. When you do that, you get involved in paralogisms and antinomies. What happens here? He says, the point is not the subjective epistemological problem of what is it to reason about things. He says, what is it in those things that makes them rational? They're objects of rationality. That's what Kant says. But what makes them rational in themselves? He gives you the answer. The answer is that the infinitude in them is not them empty abstractions from the finite. It's not a universality that is void of content and determination, but is the fulfilled universality. There's concrete universality, determinate universality. The concept that is determined and is truly in possession of its determinateness, namely in that it differentiates itself internally and is the unity of its thus intelligible and determined differences. Only in this way does reason rise above the finite, the conditioned, the sensuous, or however one might define it. And it is in this negativity essentially replete with content. Bears content within itself. So it doesn't need you to give it content. You don't need to ascribe things to it. The nature of reality is just fine without you, right? It can make its own content. That's what we're looking at, is how it does precisely that. So he says, for as unity, it is the unity of determinate extremes. And so the rational is nothing but the syllogism. Now notice, rationality can't there mean, he's just borrowed it, right? It doesn't mean our finite minds and how we use them. It's got to mean what's rational in things themselves. You know, what makes God rational object? What makes the freedom a rational object? What makes infinity rational? What are these? What's rational in them? What's rational in them is that they're syllogistic. The nature of reality is syllogistic. That's Hegel's preposterous claim. So when you're reading these syllogistic forms, think about them as, well, the ways we infer. They're absolutely that, right? Don't ever back off from that. Hegel believes that. He thinks that these are the ways, you know, long-standing laws, rules of thought. He absolutely believes that. He just doesn't think that's all they are. They're also the nature of reality itself. And in fact, they're going to entail precisely that claim, because as you'll see, the disjunctive syllogism entails objectivity. How's that work? All right, that's enough. We're a little bit, we've got a little bit of time here left. Questions, issues, problems? Yeah, Neil.
I have two unrelated questions. So the first one is on the difference between the judgments table here and Kant's. The one that seems to be the only one that's actually different and the little this x is y thing is the infinite one, which for Kant would be this x is non-y.
Yeah.
Is there something, I mean, here it's because this is just the way the infinite deduction has to work and whatnot, but is there something more to explore there? And that difference, why is it?
So, I'm sorry.
No, keep going, sorry.
So, couple things to say back to that. One is that you're exactly right. Let's just start with that. It's not the thing to say about it, but let's just affirm that. The infinite form in Kant is this x is not this y or whatever. Hegel says in his discussion of the infinite judgment form that this is not this would also fit under there, right? So he does want to incorporate what Kant did, but he thinks that Kant is only thinking about infinity as a negative, right? It's not this, it's not this, it's not this. So it's always a predication of negativity. It's always not this, not, because it's beyond all of those determinations, right? And he's saying, well, no, it's actually just as infinite to say it is itself, right? To do a tautology. So Hegel wants the judgment form to be such that it's positive, not the negative, in order to incorporate both the tautology and the nonsense. The nonsense is the negative infinity view, but also the empty tautology of just x is x, right, which is just as infinite in this sense because it's reflectively infinite as the negative infinite would be. So that's a discussion about how does Kant and Hegel think about infinity and differ on the nature of infinity. And Hegel is saying, look, Kant only has a conception of infinity that's negative. That is to say that it's always beyond this, beyond this, beyond this. It's always one more, right? So it's what we called earlier in the text a spurious form of infinity. And Hegel wants to say, well, infinity actually has this reflexive moment, circular moment, and that's what he's trying to capture with infinity there. He thinks that's the proper judgment form. That's why they differ on that issue.
Okay.
As best I can tell. There may be other reasons, but there's at least that.
And then the second question, it's coming off the tail of a question that was asked forever ago, last quarter, on whether or not there's a moment of apodicticity in the system.
Yeah.
And you were saying how your stance is that there isn't. And there's three ways I can think of that being the case. One of them, which I just don't think is the case, is that there is no category of apodicticity or anything like that whatsoever, but we can see here that the notion of apodicticity
there's a judgment form.
Yeah, exactly. It has an intelligent structure to that. But then the other two is that there is a category of apodicticity as a judgment form, but it's not something that can be meaningfully applied to the system, either the system as a whole or to the logic. And then the other one would be that it can be applied to the system as a whole or to logic, but because the system is what actually sets the standard for what apodicticity is, there's maybe some sort of self-defeating character to that or something like that.
Yeah. I'm not sure I understand the self-defeating character.
Just because it'd be like setting your own rule. And then you could later discover that you were wrong about it.
You've rigged the game in that sense, right? And if you don't have it, then it's because you set it up in a certain way.
I'm not saying that has the rigged language maybe is too normative, but
yeah. So I appreciate this question. So I think what I was trying to say earlier, I hope what I was trying to say earlier, is when I was answering that question about apodicticity is, I don't think there's a moment of intuitive givenness that's apodictically certain at the beginning of the logic and everything's derived from that. So that's the Fichtean move, right? Fichte can say, look, what's apodictically given is I. That's unquestionable. It's intuitively there's no demonstration of that. It's self-givenly true, and so self-evidently true. So everything can be derived from that, but it itself can't be derived. So that's what apodicticity means as a fundamental axiomatic first principle, and there's not that in Hegel, and that's not what that is either. So there's not that in Hegel. What there is in Hegel is a thinking of apodicticity as a moment of genus necessarily, without question, self-evidently being only this proliferation, differentiation of itself, which is what that is, right? So when he says X is necessarily Y, he's not saying it's self-evidently the case that we can see this and then everything else can be derived from this. He's saying it can't but be this demonstration, this proliferation, this differentiation of itself, because that's all it is. It can't be anything other than that. But we've shown that, right? So that's been demonstrated. This is what, that's why it comes at the end, so to speak, is that we've been able to establish that apodictic, which the term we would normally use is just self-evidently given. This is anything but self-evidently given. It's something that we've argued all the way through to show and prove. And then apodicticity has been earned, not taken for granted. And that's the difference, right? It's not a presupposition of what the concept is. It's been shown to be the absolute fundamental nature of the concept by demonstration, which is here's where you go with, you've given yourself your own definition of apodicticity. It's an apodicticity that's been earned, established, demonstrated, and won, rather than one that's been presupposed, which is our standard conception of how apodicticity is supposed to work, right? But if other people have talked about apodicticity, I'm thinking about Husserl does it this way. But you can also look at, there's a version of this I want to say in Descartes, I could be wrong about that, where apodicticity is one, established, achieved, demonstrated, by virtue of you having an insight, and the insight is it couldn't be any other way, right? So it's the invariability, right? This is like, in Husserl, this is eidetic insight, right? You just have this, and this feature, right? This is like, I think he says this, Husserl says this in the Internal Time Consciousness lectures, where he says something like, the primal impression, the future, and the retention and the protension, that's a structure that's ineliminable. And you can see that because you couldn't vary primal impression. You can vary primal impression in all sorts of ways, but you can't vary primal impression out from retention and protension and there ever be a primal impression. So that's an invariant apodictic structure. But that's something that's won through the variation procedure, right? Descartes has a version of that. I'm not remembering of that. I want to say it's in the Meditations, but I'm blanking on where it's at. But there's a moment of just where you see this, but you see it not by virtue of just seeing it immediately, which is the Fichtean sort of thing, where you just see it and you can't deny it, and then you go from there, the self-evidence of it. But it's something that's one, it's achieved by virtue of demonstration. Let's use the term broadly, demonstration.
And I'm wondering how that,
which is what's going on,
could not maybe apply too early in the logic. Let's see if we're talking about the very first chapter in the logic of being, nothing, becoming. There's a way in which it couldn't be otherwise, because to talk about any of that logic in any other way would be to give a determinate content to being in some way. Be like, oh well, being is this stuff or something. You'd be so part of the way that logic seems to work is on there being no possible otherwise to describe it. That's kind of vaguely clear.
I think that's quite helpful. I mean, because it is quite true that the Hegelian response to why do we begin with being is, well, that's the most primitive category we can begin with. It's the absence of any determination whatsoever. So if we're going to talk about the logic of determination, which is what the science of logic's ultimate goal is, then we've got to start with that which is completely, without any determinations whatsoever, because we can't presuppose, this is what you were alluding to, I think, can't presuppose any determination. So if we started with any other category, if we started, say, for example, with quantity, then we would already be ahead of ourselves, because we would have assumed, that there's this, that there's a kind of discreteness, there's a kind of completeness, all those things that go with quantity, or any of the other categories that are subsequently derived.
You can't start with anything that means anything, because then you could have started by meaning something else.
Yes.
Start with something.
So there's where you can, you always fall into the trap of you can't presuppose any determination, so anything less than being. So there's a necessity, apodicticity, that it has to be begun with that. And I think there's a lot to that. So I don't want to, and what I'm about to say, reject that. I think there's a lot to that, right? I do think that's probably right. But it's always seemed to me that even within those parameters of you can't start with any presupposing anything, you could have begun with nothing.
Okay.
And, on my riskier days, I would say, so those aren't very good days, but, on the riskier days, I would say, well, you could have begun with becoming. Because what is there other than becoming? Right? You'll say, well, that's not primitive enough. That's not fundamental enough. Well, it's coming into being and passing out of being. That's indeterminacy becoming determinate, going back into indeterminacy. That is fundamental in that way. So you can make arguments about other very basic terms like that, like being, nothing, becoming. So is that particular order apodictic? I don't know. I'm not sure about that. That's the response back to that. Now notice that I've admitted from that at the beginning, right? The standard orthodox Hegelian answer is you had to start with being for the reasons I gave. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, but then the thing, I guess the point with starting with becoming or starting with nothing is if that were to mean anything different than starting with being, then I feel like we may have found ourselves a problem. But I feel like part of the point of saying you could have started with nothing, you could have started with becoming, is that it's actually a meaningless distinction to make. Being is nothing, and immediately so.
Yes, I think that's why you can do what I'm suggesting you can do, right? And I agree to that completely. That the only way you could start with nothing is if it means what being is in the absence of any determination. It's nothing. right? So it really, I mean, to begin with nothing is just to begin with being at that point, right? And becoming is similarly to begin with being and nothing, because that's what so in that sense, yes, I would agree with that, challenge back to the idea that you can start with any one of them, because really, in my claim that you're starting with any one of them, you're really still beginning with, the fundamental point is indeterminacy. That there's an absence of determination completely. That's what being is, but that means being is nothing. But the thing I think could be interesting here, I don't know that this is interesting, but I think it could be interesting, is there's something about saying that being is nothing and nothing is being, and that is becoming. That can't be said at any other level of the logic. Because those aren't oppositions. That's not a contradiction. Being and nothing don't contradict one another. They are one another, right? And becoming is just the name for that, self-sameness of those two moments. And that, I think, is unique in the totality of the logic.
People get that the other way. People often try to use being and nothing as a paradigmatic case for the movement, the triadic movement, but it's actually perhaps the exception.
I think that's true, and I'm guilty as charged on using it as a triadic example. I did it in my dissertation defense, by the way. I had someone in the audience ask me, give me an example of the dialectical movement. I tried it out, being, nothing, becoming, and I said, here's the first moment, here's the second moment, here's the third moment, and it, subsumes the other two moments. What an idiot this person was. So, yes, right? But it doesn't follow that, as I think the text quite clearly says, and that's because Hegel doesn't really work in this triadic logic thing that we ascribe to him, right? So yes. So maybe that's so what I'm acknowledging is that only with those three concepts, those three categories, can you work that way and say any one of them could have been the beginning, but you couldn't say, well, the beginning was with quality, so it's with determinants, with Dasein. That's already presupposing too much. But becoming, yeah, nothing, being, because they all meet don't they all meet the precondition of no presupposition? I think the answer to that is yes, but for reasons that you gave, they only work that way because of the way they're defined in relationship to one another. Do you want to come back to that or say?
We're way past time.
Yeah, are we? I'm sorry, we're over time. Thanks everyone for coming, I appreciate it. I'll see you next week. We'll move on to syllogisms, which everything is syllogistic, right? So you want to find out about that. So come back next week and we'll talk about syllogism. You'll get to hear me rant on about my favorite syllogism, which is of course the disjunctive syllogism. Everybody loves it. Everybody loves it. You'll walk out loving it next week. But it is the best syllogism.